January 1944. East Anglia is locked in winter. The airfield is a grid of concrete and frost, edged by hedgerows and blackout huts. Floodlights cut thin cones through mist that smells of damp grass and exhaust. A line of fighters sits under a skin of ice. Sleek noses, broad wings, canopies clouded from the night cold. On the dispersal, ground crew move with practiced speed. Gloves slap metal, fuel caps twist tight, ammunition belts vanish into the dark mouths of wing bays. Somewhere nearby, a Merlin engine catches and steadies into a hard, confident roar that seems too powerful for the fragile, sleeping countryside around it. In the briefing room, the map is already marked. The red line doesn't stop where it used to. It runs past the familiar names, past the last turning points where escorts once peeled away, and it keeps going, deeper, farther, toward the kind of targets that used to mean a lonely flight and a sky full of German guns. Outside, propellers bite into cold air, and on the far side of the continent, German telephones begin to ring, because this time, the escorts are coming all the way. By the winter of 1943-1944, the air war over Europe had settled into a brutal rhythm. Night after night, the Royal Air Force crossed the Channel in heavy formations, spreading fire across German cities. Day after day, the United States Army Air Forces followed. Tight bomber boxes flying straight and level in clear skies, trusting altitude, discipline, and overlapping gunfire to keep them alive. It was a theory born before the war. Precision bombing, flown in daylight, would cripple Germany's industry without the need for mass area destruction. American planners believed that self-defending bombers, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, could fight their way through any opposition if they stayed together. The formation itself was the weapon. Reality had already begun to dismantle that belief. In 1942 and early 1943, the 8th Air Force was still finding its footing. Aircraft numbers were rising, but experience was thin. Crews learned their trade in combat, discovering the limits of training manuals at 30,000 feet. German defenses, by contrast, were mature and coordinated. Radar stations along the coast fed information into a centralized command system. Fighter controllers plotted interception points with precision, guiding squadrons into the bomber streams at exactly the right altitude and angle. The Luftwaffe did not need to destroy every bomber. It only needed to destroy enough. German fighter tactics evolved quickly. Head-on attacks, once considered too dangerous, became routine, slashing through formations before gunners could react. Cannons replaced lighter armament, firing explosive shells designed to tear aircraft apart in seconds. A single, well-placed burst could remove a bomber from the sky, its formation breaking just long enough for the next attacker to strike. What the bombers lacked, above all else, was constant protection. Early American escorts existed, but they were limited by physics more than courage. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful and rugged, but thirsty. The P-38 Lightning had range, but struggled in European weather and at extreme altitudes. Escort fighters could shepherd bombers partway into Germany, but at a certain point, fuel gauges dictated reality. They turned back, leaving the bombers alone in hostile airspace. German pilots knew this pattern well. They waited. The consequences were laid bare in 1943. Raids on deeply defended industrial targets, most famously Schweinfurt and Regensburg, exacted a price the 8th Air Force could not ignore. Entire crews failed to return. Aircraft assembly lines in England could replace aluminum and engines, but not trained men at the same speed. Loss rates climbed into territory no Air Force could sustain for long. By late summer, missions deep into Germany were being reconsidered. Not abandoned, but delayed. The Americans needed time, numbers, and something they did not yet fully possess: a fighter that could stay with the bombers for the entire journey. On the German side, confidence was still intact. The Luftwaffe had been bloodied, but it remained a dangerous force. Fighter bases dotted the Reich. Veteran pilots still filled squadron rosters. When unescorted bombers crossed into the heart of Germany, they were not seen as invincible machines. They were seen as opportunities. Yet beneath that confidence, strain was already forming. The defense of the Reich demanded constant readiness. Pilots flew multiple sorties in a single day, climbing repeatedly to high altitude, engaging, landing, refueling, and scrambling again. Aircraft wore out faster than they could be replaced. Fuel consumption rose steadily as the tempo increased. Training hours began to shrink, not because instructors had lost interest, but because fuel and time were becoming precious commodities. Still, in late 1943, the balance in the sky had not yet tipped. Bomber crews crossed the German frontier, knowing the escorts would not always be there. German pilots climbed knowing that, eventually, they would be. The question hanging over the air war was simple and unanswered. How long could daylight bombing continue like this before the losses became unbearable? That question would be answered not by bombers, but by the aircraft that flew beside them. By the end of 1943, American daylight bombing faced a dangerous contradiction. The 8th Air Force could hit targets that mattered: ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, oil infrastructure. But the deeper it went, the more its own strength drained away in the sky. It was a strategic campaign that threatened to consume the very crews meant to carry it forward. American commanders were not blind to the math. They read the missing aircraft boards. They watched squadrons thin. They listened to the survivors describe what happened when the escorts turned back, how the fighter attacks became bolder, more organized, more merciless, because the bombers had nowhere to run and no one to chase the attackers off. And yet, the pressure to continue only grew. Germany's war machine was still producing. New fighters rolled off assembly lines. Flak batteries multiplied around vital industrial zones. And in 1943, the Luftwaffe was still capable of concentrating force, of throwing massed formations into the bomber stream, punching holes through it, and doing it again on the return leg when stragglers fell behind. The Americans needed a way to force a different kind of fight. By early 1944, that idea began to crystallize into a strategy, not simply to bomb Germany, but to break the Luftwaffe itself. The logic was cold and direct. If the German fighter arm could be destroyed in the air, then bomber losses would fall, targets could be hit repeatedly, and the path would open for everything that would follow: amphibious landings, ground offensives, and the steady unraveling of German mobility. This was the thinking behind the major offensive that would come to be remembered as Big Week in February 1944, a concentrated assault on German aircraft production, aimed at forcing the Luftwaffe into the air in large numbers, where it could be engaged, worn down, and diminished. Bombs would strike factories and airfields, but fighters would be hunting fighters. That hunting required something the 8th Air Force had been chasing for 2 years: range. The aircraft that offered it was the North American P-51 Mustang, particularly in its Merlin-powered form, which combined speed and high-altitude performance with the endurance needed to cross into the Reich and stay there. But the Mustang was not a magic wand, and its impact was not instantaneous. It required numbers. It required pilots trained to use it properly, and it required doctrine to catch up with possibility. In the early escort phase, fighters had been treated like living shields, kept tight to the bombers, tasked primarily with preventing direct attacks. It was protective, but it also allowed German fighters to choose the moment of engagement, slipping in and out, attacking when the escorts were out of position, then disengaging to attack again later. The shift that followed was subtle but decisive. Escorts would not only guard, they would disrupt. They would push outward from the bomber stream to intercept attackers before they could form, before they could build momentum. And when they found German fighters, especially on the ground or climbing to altitude, they would deny them the freedom to assemble. This change did not remove risk from bomber missions. It changed the distribution of risk. Instead of bombers absorbing the full weight of the interception system, escort fighters would now collide with the Luftwaffe in the spaces where German planning depended on time and coordination. And that meant the Luftwaffe was about to lose one of its greatest advantages, the predictable moment when escorts turned back. German pilots had developed expectations. They knew where the pressure would increase, where the bomber formations would start to thin, where a damaged aircraft would peel away alone. They had learned to fight this war like a routine. Dangerous, yes, but familiar in its pattern. Now a new pattern was forming. Mustangs began appearing where they shouldn't have been, not just over the coast, not just over the Low Countries, but deeper, over the approaches to central Germany, still overhead when the bombers pushed toward targets that once guaranteed isolation. At first, it could seem like an exception, a lucky day, a rare long reach. Then it happened again and again. For the men in the Luftwaffe fighter units, the psychological terrain began to shift. The bomber stream was no longer simply the main event. The escorts were becoming a constant presence, fast, persistent, and increasingly aggressive. The air war was starting to feel less like a series of set-piece interceptions and more like an encirclement. The old assumption that the bombers would eventually be left alone was fading. And in that fading, the Luftwaffe's entire defensive routine began to fracture. Because when escort fighters could reach Berlin and still have enough fuel and time to fight on the way home, the Reich was no longer protected by distance. It was protected only by what it could put in the air and what it could keep alive. For bomber crews, the war was often endured in long minutes of waiting. A B-17 or B-24 climbed slowly, heavy with fuel and bombs, until the world below became a map. Then it leveled off and held course, straight lines across hostile sky, engines droning with the sameness of machinery that cannot flinch. They could not dodge much. They could not run. Their courage was measured in discipline, holding formation while flak burst around them, while fighters carved through the edges, while oxygen masks froze against their faces. When escorts were present, there was at least the comfort of motion above them, small shapes turning into larger shapes, friendly wings intercepting the threat before it arrived. When escorts turned back, the air changed. It wasn't only that German fighters attacked more often, it was that the bomber crews could feel the shift in confidence. Attacks came in organized waves, timed to exploit stragglers and wounded aircraft. A hit bomber couldn't hide. It fell out of formation and instantly became the center of the universe for every enemy pilot looking for the simplest kill. For escort pilots, fear had a different shape. Their aircraft could maneuver, dive, climb, and choose angles, but the risk was constant proximity to decision, seconds that determined whether they lived or died. The Mustang pilot's job was not only to protect, it was to arrive early, to be present when the bomber crews most needed someone overhead, and to stay long enough that the enemy could not simply wait them out. The promise of escort was psychological as much as tactical, and by 1944, that promise was being tested at the farthest edge of Germany. That human tension, waiting versus hunting, leads straight into how the fight was actually fought in the air. The battle for daylight skies was never random. It was geometry at high speed. German defenses worked like a net. Radar detected incoming formations. Controllers measured altitude, direction, and timing, then guided fighters to interception points, placing them above and ahead of bombers whenever possible. From that advantage, German pilots could dive through the formation with speed, firing briefly, then using momentum to break away and climb again for another pass. Head-on attacks became especially dangerous. A fighter coming straight at a bomber reduced the gunner's reaction time to a few seconds. Closure speeds were immense. A short burst from cannon could cripple an engine or shatter a cockpit before defensive fire could properly converge. Bomber formations tried to protect themselves through overlap, interlocking fields of fire, each aircraft covering another. But formations had weak points, edges, gaps, damaged ships, and the inevitable drift caused by weather and turbulence. The Luftwaffe aimed for those fractures. The escort fighter's role was to break the timing. If escorts stayed tight to bombers, they could respond after the attack began. But if escorts moved outward, seeking German fighters as they climbed, assembled, and positioned, then the interception could be disrupted before it matured. It forced German pilots to fight earlier than planned, lower than preferred, without the clean altitude advantage they relied on, and perhaps most importantly, it forced them to defend themselves. Once a German fighter had to engage enemy fighters before it could reach bombers, it lost the initiative. It became reactive. It burned fuel. It lost formation cohesion. And when escort fighters stayed with the bomber stream deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe couldn't simply disengage and wait for the return leg. The same pressure followed the bombers home. The tactical heart of the Mustang story isn't just that it could reach Berlin. It's that it could be there long enough to make interception uneconomical. That tactical change didn't happen by accident. It was shaped by leadership decisions that rewired the entire campaign. Wars don't pivot only on machines. They pivot on permissions. For much of the early daylight campaign, escort fighters were treated as a defensive perimeter. Their duty was clear: stay with the bombers, discourage attacks, and avoid chasing enemies so far that the bomber stream was left exposed. It was a protective mindset, born from necessity, because escorts were scarce, fuel was limited, and commanders feared losing fighters in fruitless pursuits. But as losses mounted, it became clear that protection alone was not enough. The Luftwaffe could absorb defensive escorting. It could choose when to strike. It could disengage and come back later. So leadership began to accept a harder truth. The bomber force would never be safe until the Luftwaffe was worn down. Not intimidated, not temporarily scattered, worn down, pilot by pilot, aircraft by aircraft, sortie by sortie. That required escorts to be used aggressively. It meant allowing fighters to hunt beyond the immediate bomber formation, to attack German fighters assembling for interception, to strike airfields when the opportunity appeared, and to pursue when pursuit would reduce the enemy's ability to re-engage later. It was an operational gamble, because it temporarily thinned the protective ring around bombers. But it also offered something previously impossible: turning the escort from a shield into a weapon. The Mustang made that gamble practical. With endurance came options. With options came new orders. And with new orders came a new kind of fear on the German side, the fear that the interceptors would be intercepted. When escorts could stay, the Luftwaffe couldn't simply wait. It had to fight under pressure, repeatedly, deep over its own territory. And that leads naturally to the next layer, because the question becomes why the Mustang could do what earlier escorts could not. In the air war over Europe, range was not a convenience. It was a boundary line drawn in fuel. The Mustang's importance wasn't just that it was fast or agile. Many fighters were fast, and plenty could turn tightly at the right altitude. The breakthrough was that the P-51 combined performance with endurance in a way that changed the map. It could climb with the bombers, stay at high altitude where the fight actually happened, and still have the fuel to remain a threat deep into enemy territory. That endurance did not come from a single miracle component. It was a system. Efficient aerodynamics reduced drag. Internal fuel capacity gave it a longer reach. External drop tanks, simple, brutal in their logic, extended it further. The fighter crossed into combat with extra fuel hanging under its wings, then discarded those tanks when the time came to fight, shedding weight and drag in an instant. This created a new kind of constant presence. Earlier escorts could cover the route partway and then vanish, leaving the bombers to face the most dangerous miles alone. The Mustang could stay for those miles. It could still be there when the bombers turned for home. When aircraft were damaged, formations were stretched, and German pilots had traditionally found their easiest kills. In this sense, the P-51 wasn't just an escort fighter. It was a moving extension of American operational reach, pushing the safe corridor farther and farther until too deep became a smaller and smaller concept. And once range becomes a weapon, the enemy is forced to answer with more than tactics. It has to answer with resources, which is exactly where the Luftwaffe began to falter, because its defense system was running out of the things that keep pilots alive and effective. From the ground, the Reich's air defense still looked formidable. Airfields were active. Fighter units still launched on warning. Anti-aircraft guns ringed cities and industrial zones. The system could still assemble large interceptions when needed. But in 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting with an economy of scarcity. Fuel was tightening, and fuel isn't just mobility, it's training. A fighter pilot who cannot fly enough hours in practice becomes a pilot who learns in combat. That kind of learning is expensive, paid in wrecked aircraft and dead men. As the war dragged on, Germany's ability to produce new pilots did not match its rate of losing experienced ones. The veteran corps, men who understood energy fighting, gunnery patience, and survival instincts, thinned with every month. Then the problem compounded. A pilot shortage isn't just fewer fighters in the air. It's fewer leaders to anchor formations, fewer mentors to stabilize new arrivals, fewer calm voices on the radio when weather and chaos break cohesion. And the Mustang's long escort meant those new German pilots weren't simply encountering bombers, the predictable, lumbering target. They were encountering American fighters first, in unfamiliar situations, sometimes before they even reached altitude. That changed the psychology of interception. Scrambles became riskier. Climbouts became vulnerable. Formations could be disrupted before they ever formed. German pilots, who had once expected to engage bombers, now found themselves forced into fighter versus fighter combat repeatedly, often deep over their own land, but with less freedom than it sounds. Because every minute spent fighting escorts was a minute burned in fuel, in stress, in aircraft wear, and in the slow attrition of irreplaceable experience. The Luftwaffe didn't lose its will overnight. It began to lose its margin for error. And in a war fought at hundreds of miles per hour, margin is everything. Which brings us to the moral weight carried by everyone under these contrails. The escort story is often told as a clean duel, fighter against fighter, skill against skill. But it was never clean. Every escorted raid meant bombers reaching targets more reliably. It meant factories, rail yards, oil sites, and city-adjacent industries absorbing the impact of high explosives and fire. Even when target plans aimed at specific industrial nodes, bombs missed in cloud, smoke, or evasive maneuvers. Flak forced formation changes. Damage scattered aircraft. The physics of bombing from altitude meant that precision was a goal pursued under conditions that resisted it. For crews in the air, these were not abstract questions. They were lived burdens. Bombardiers stared through sights at a world far below, knowing that their release would become real in the streets and rooftops beneath the aim point. Pilots, meanwhile, fought to protect bombers, because protecting bombers meant sustaining the campaign that leadership believed necessary to end the war sooner and reduce losses on the ground. On the German side, pilots climbed to defend their homeland while their own cities were being hit. Many were not ideologues. Many were simply men in uniform, pulled into the machinery of a state at war, flying because the alternative was collapse. The escort fighter did not create the moral complexity of the bombing war, but it intensified it because it made the raids harder to stop. And that is why the turning point matters. Not as a technological triumph, but as a moment when one side gained the ability to impose its will in the sky, deep into Germany, all the way to Berlin and back, until the Luftwaffe could no longer shape the battle on its own terms. The decisive change didn't announce itself with a single explosion. It arrived in the order of a mission. The day begins in England the way so many did. Darkness thinning into gray, coffee swallowed too fast, briefings held under the hush of men who already know the risks. Target maps are pinned up. Routes are traced. Wind forecasts read aloud, flak concentrations marked with blunt certainty. And then, in the details, something feels different. The escort plan doesn't end early. In earlier months, bomber crews could almost sense the invisible border where protection would fade. They didn't need a clock. They watched the escorts peel off in small groups, turning west, becoming specks against the sun, until the bombers were alone, carrying their own fate deeper into the Reich. The Luftwaffe knew that moment too. It was a predictable hinge in the day's violence. Now the hinge is missing. Mustangs lift from English runways in steady succession, engines tight and bright, climbing into formation over the coast. They gather around the bomber stream like a moving roof, high cover and close cover, elements stacked at different altitudes, each responsible for watching a sector of sky that could conceal an attacker until the last second. Over the channel, the world below turns slate and white. The bombers drone on, heavy and methodical. The fighters are restless, weaving gently, conserving energy, scanning constantly. It is a long transit into danger, and the real battle is not at the target. It begins much earlier, where German interceptors are trying to assemble. On the continent, the warning system lights up. Radar stations detect the mass moving east. Telephone lines carry the same blunt report. A large formation, high altitude, heading inland. At fighter bases, scramble orders snap men into motion. Engines turn over. Aircraft taxi and lift in steep climbs, trying to reach altitude before the bombers arrive. And then, something happens that had not happened often enough before to feel normal. The escorts do not wait. Mustangs push outward from the bomber stream, seeking the German fighters while they are still climbing, still forming up, still dependent on coordination. It is a contest over timing. If German pilots can reach altitude en masse, they can strike with advantage. If they are forced into combat early, in fragments, they lose the clean geometry that makes interceptions efficient. So the sky over the approach routes becomes a battlefield ahead of the main body. A German pilot climbing hard sees movement above him, too high, too fast, coming down with choice and speed. This is not the moment he expected to meet enemy fighters. This is not the safe phase before the attack run. Suddenly, he is defending himself before he has even reached the place he intended to fight. The fighter versus fighter struggle spreads like weather. Below, bomber formations press onward, their engines drumming with the slow certainty of weight. Above, the escorts are burning fuel and time to do something more valuable, to break the interception plan before it can become a synchronized assault on the bombers. Some German attacks still get through. No escort system is perfect. But the nature of the threat changes. Instead of wave after wave, it becomes disrupted strikes, smaller groups, rushed approaches, pilots forced to commit without ideal positioning. The bombers are still under pressure, still flying through flak and danger, but they are no longer the only object in the sky. The Luftwaffe is being pulled into a second fight it cannot avoid. As the route continues deeper into Germany, the psychological line that once protected the Reich begins to blur. Cities and landmarks pass beneath the bomber stream, names once associated with the point of maximum vulnerability, and still, the Mustangs remain. They are still there when the bomber formations pass the thresholds that used to mean isolation. They are still there when the target area grows near enough that flak bursts begin to rise like black flowers in the thin air. And on the German side, the realization is immediate and unsettling. The escorts have not turned back. This means the return leg, once the Luftwaffe's second chance, is no longer guaranteed. It means damaged bombers may not become easy kills. It means fighters that break off now may find enemy fighters waiting again later, not only on the way in, but on the way out. For the first time in this campaign, the deep heart of Germany is covered by a persistent American fighter presence. Not a brief appearance, not a partial shield, a constant. And as the bombers approach the space that includes Berlin's reach, where the Reich's defenses are thickest and pride is sharpest, the air war tightens into something more decisive than a raid. Because the Luftwaffe is about to discover that endurance changes everything. The escorts can fight now, and still be there to fight again when the bombers turn for home. The most dangerous part of a deep raid was often not the bomb run, it was the escape. On the way in, formations were tight, crews were alert, fuel was plentiful enough to hold discipline. But after bombs fell, the airspace became a funnel. Aircraft were damaged, engines ran rough, oxygen systems failed. A bomber that had held station perfectly over the channel might now lag by a few miles, just enough to become visible as prey. For months, German pilots had built a routine around that reality. They could miss an interception on the inbound leg and still look for stragglers on the way out. They could hold fuel for one last pass. They could coordinate a second effort when the bombers were turning west, lower on options, and sometimes lower on altitude. That was the old rhythm. Now the escorts remained overhead, still alert, still moving, still dangerous. When the bombers turned for home, the Mustang elements did not vanish into the distance. They did not peel off at the familiar borders. They stayed long enough to deny the Luftwaffe its most reliable second act. The German pilots who tried to reform for another attack found themselves intercepted again, forced into defensive turns and dives. Their energy bled away under pressure. And the psychological effect was immediate. A fighter pilot who expects to strike an exhausted bomber formation is thinking like a predator. A fighter pilot who discovers enemy fighters still above him, still willing to engage, must think first about survival. That shift is corrosive. It disrupts timing, reduces aggression, and fractures coordination. The return leg becomes a running battle. Above the bombers, Mustangs sweep and weave, climbing to gain altitude advantage, diving to break up forming attacks, then climbing again, always conscious of fuel, but no longer trapped by it. This is the quiet power of endurance. The ability to choose when to fight, not merely when fuel forces you to. German fighters still attack because they must. The defense of the Reich is not optional, but the calculus has changed. Each attack now carries a higher cost because the escorts are not simply present, they are proactive. They move to meet the threat, to engage it early, to cut it down before it reaches the bombers, and to chase it far enough that it cannot quickly return. This is where the phrase Berlin and back becomes more than geography. It becomes a statement of control. Berlin represented distance, danger, density of defenses, and symbolic weight. For American crews, it was the kind of target that once meant maximum risk, where the Luftwaffe would be concentrated and the skies would be hardest to survive. The ability to escort bombers to that depth and still cover their withdrawal meant the Luftwaffe could no longer rely on distance to do its work for it. The Reich's heart was no longer protected by the Escort's fuel limits. Instead, it was exposed to a sustained contest for air superiority, day after day, raid after raid, where German pilots had to fight not only the bombers, but the fighters meant to destroy them. And when a system is forced to fight on the enemy's terms, it begins to break. The Luftwaffe's dilemma becomes cruel and unavoidable. If German fighters engage aggressively, they risk losing pilots in fighter-to-fighter combat against escorts that are increasingly numerous, increasingly skilled, and increasingly free to pursue. If they hold back to preserve aircraft and men, the bombers reach their targets with less interference, and the very industry that supports the Luftwaffe is hammered again. Either choice is a form of loss. By the time the surviving aircraft stream back toward the channel, the air behind them feels different. Not safe, never safe, but altered. The sky is no longer a sequence of zones where danger rises and falls according to predictable escort limits. It has become continuous pressure, extending across Germany in a way that makes the Luftwaffe's defensive routine feel outdated in real time. On English airfields, Mustangs land with fuel gauges lower than escort pilots once accepted as reasonable. Ground crews rush in, counting bullet holes, reading the scorch marks, helping men climb out stiff and silent. Bomber crews return with empty positions where friends should be, but for the first time, there is also a new, hard observation forming in the debriefings. They were not left alone. On the German side, the counting is colder. Sortie lists, aircraft status boards, pilots not returning, veterans missing, new faces replacing them too quickly. The defense of the Reich was built on the ability to meet bombers at chosen points, strike hard, and strike again. Now, that structure is being attacked at every stage: assembly, interception, withdrawal. The turning point is not simply that a fighter could go far. It is that it could stay. And staying meant the Luftwaffe could no longer wait out the escorts. It had to fight through them, every mile, until the cost of defending the sky began to exceed what Germany could afford. The effects of long-range escort did not remain trapped in cockpit stories. They surfaced in patterns, measurable, repeatable, impossible to ignore. Deep penetration raids had once carried a predictable tax in aircraft and crews. When escorts could not stay, bomber loss rates rose sharply the farther missions went into Germany, especially on targets surrounded by concentrated fighter bases and layered flak belts. Once Mustangs began escorting consistently to the deepest objectives, and crucially, remaining long enough to protect the withdrawal, the most catastrophic spikes became harder for the Luftwaffe to reliably reproduce. This did not mean the skies became safe. Bombers still fell. Fighters still died. Flak remained an industrial-scale killer. Weather scattered formations and made stragglers. But the old condition, bombers isolated in the most lethal airspace, began to fade. The Luftwaffe could still inflict damage, but it could no longer shape the battle with the same freedom. And that distinction mattered. Because the strategic bombing campaign was not a single strike, it was repetition. A factory hit once could be repaired. A rail junction bombed once could be cleared. What broke systems was sustained pressure, targets revisited, transport networks repeatedly disrupted, and recovery time denied. Long-range escort enabled that sustained pressure. It also created a second effect that cut deeper than bomb damage: pilot attrition. The Luftwaffe had always faced losses, but its defensive model depended on experienced pilots who could fight efficiently, who could attack bombers without wasting time and fuel, who could coordinate in the air, who knew when to disengage and live to fight again. The arrival of persistent escorts turned that efficiency into a liability. German fighter units were forced into more frequent engagements with enemy fighters. The contest became less about selecting the best moment to strike bombers and more about surviving repeated clashes with escorts that could appear far from where German pilots expected them. Experience began to bleed out of the system. When veterans were lost, they were replaced by men with fewer hours in the air, fewer instincts, and less familiarity with combat at high altitude. These newer pilots faced a sky that offered no gentle introduction. They were thrown into engagements against opponents who increasingly held advantages in numbers, endurance, and operational freedom. The loss of a veteran was not only a single casualty, it was the loss of a teacher, a formation leader, a stabilizing presence. It reduced the effectiveness of every pilot around him. Meanwhile, the escort fighters themselves became a kind of offensive instrument beyond their initial role. With the Luftwaffe forced up to meet raids, American fighters could engage them repeatedly and, when opportunities emerged, strike them at their most vulnerable, during climbouts, while assembling, or when returning low on fuel. The air war shifted from reactive defense to proactive denial. Even German success began to feel hollow. A raid that inflicted some bomber losses but cost the Luftwaffe trained pilots and aircraft was a strategic defeat, because Germany's replacement pipeline could not easily restore those losses under mounting pressure. Industry was being bombed. Fuel supplies were tightening. Training hours shrank further. Maintenance struggled under constant operations. By mid-1944, the results were visible in operational behavior. Fighter responses became less consistent. Interceptions sometimes lacked coordination. The density of attacks fluctuated. The defense of the Reich was still dangerous, but its reliability was eroding, and reliability is what a defensive system needs most. The Mustang did not win the air war alone. It arrived into a massive coalition effort of bombers, radar, intelligence, production capacity, and mounting Allied experience. But it removed the Luftwaffe's ability to wait out escorts, removing a structural advantage that had once made deep raids a gamble with terrible odds. Now the gamble shifted sides. Germany could still fight in the air, but it was being forced to fight more often, in worse conditions, against an enemy that could afford the long campaign. And the long campaign is where the Luftwaffe began to lose the one resource it could not manufacture quickly enough: time. As the months progressed, the consequences of persistent escort extended beyond the bomber streams. Air superiority is not simply a victory statistic. It is permission for armies to move, for ships to cross, for supplies to arrive, for planning to become action without being strangled from above. By 1944, the Allies were preparing for an invasion that would depend on control of the skies. Large-scale amphibious landings required predictable airspace. Ports, beaches, road junctions, and bridges could not remain under constant threat from a still effective German air arm. The steady erosion of the Luftwaffe's daylight fighter force mattered because it removed Germany's ability to interfere at scale, at the exact moment interference could have been most decisive. Long-range escort contributed to that erosion by keeping the Luftwaffe trapped in a dilemma it could not solve. Every time German fighters rose to meet the bombers, they risked being drawn into combat with escorts. Every time they avoided combat to preserve aircraft and pilots, the bombers struck their targets with greater consistency. The air war became a grinder in which avoidance was also a kind of defeat. It wasn't necessary to destroy every German fighter in a single day. It was necessary to force the Luftwaffe into repeated losses that it could not replace at the same speed. That replacement problem became more severe as the campaign broadened. Factories could be repaired, sometimes quickly, sometimes partially. But a pilot was not a machine. A pilot represented years of training condensed into one human body. And by 1944, Germany was losing more of those bodies than it could afford. Fuel scarcity sharpened everything. Less fuel meant fewer training hours. Fewer training hours meant less competence. Less competence meant higher loss rates in combat. And higher loss rates meant the veteran corps disappeared even faster. The system spiraled, not because German pilots forgot how to fight, but because the environment no longer allowed them to build and maintain experience. For Allied air forces, the Escort Revolution left a legacy in doctrine and design. It reinforced the lesson that strategic bombing could not be separated from air superiority, that bombers were not self-contained instruments of victory, but components of a broader air campaign. It also elevated endurance as a defining trait of modern fighters. Speed and armament mattered, but staying power, range, time on station, fuel management became an operational advantage with strategic consequences. Yet, even in victory, the aftermath carried a weight that could not be polished away. The skies over Europe had become a factory of loss. American bomber groups counted missing crews by the thousands over the course of the campaign. Fighter units counted friends who did not come back from a single burst of cannon fire or a collision in cloud. German units counted their own dead while the ground beneath them burned, and while the war they were defending grew less defensible with every month. And still, the campaign continued, because by that stage, industrial war demanded momentum. Once a system of production, training, and strategy is set in motion, it does not stop gently. It grinds forward until one side can no longer feed it. The Luftwaffe's daylight defense did not collapse in a single afternoon. It weakened in increments, through fuel shortages, through disrupted production, through shrinking training pipelines, and through the relentless pressure of escorts that reached farther than German pilots had once believed possible. In that sense, the phrase Berlin and back becomes a quiet historical marker. Not a boast, but a measurement of how far control of the air had shifted, how the Allied fighter force had extended its reach until the Reich's core could not be defended in the old way. And when the sky changes hands, everything beneath it changes too, because once escorts could stay over Germany long enough to deny the Luftwaffe its routine, the outcome was no longer about a single raid or a single aircraft type. It became about an entire war turning, slowly, toward inevitability. That inevitability is where the story finally grows quiet enough to understand what it meant. In war, people often search for a single object to explain the turning of an era: a tank, a gun, a commander, a plane. The P-51 Mustang is sometimes placed in that role because it is easy to see. Sleek lines, a famous name. A fighter that arrives at the moment the air war needs an answer. But what it truly represents is something less glamorous and more decisive: endurance. Endurance is not only stamina in men, it is fuel in tanks. It is engines that can run for hours. It is the ability to stay present long enough that the enemy's plan collapses under pressure. When escorts could reach Berlin and still cover the return, distance stopped protecting Germany's skies. The Luftwaffe was forced into repeated fights it could not schedule, could not delay, and could not reliably avoid. That does not mean German pilots were foolish or blind. Many fought with skill and courage under conditions that grew steadily worse. Their problem was not a lack of bravery. It was the narrowing of resources, fuel that cut training, attrition that erased experience, and an industrial battlefield where replacement could not keep pace with loss. For the Allied airmen, the change carried its own weight. Long-range escort meant raids could be sustained, and that endurance helped shorten the path to air superiority. But it also meant the bombing campaign became harder to stop, and the consequences on the ground became harder to escape. The contrails above Europe were never just lines in the sky. They were decisions, made daily, repeated until the war's machinery yielded. And so the story of the Mustang is ultimately a story about control. Not control of a single battle, but control of the route, the timing, the return home. Because in the end, the Luftwaffe didn't simply lose a duel. It lost the ability to make the sky behave the way it needed it to. And once that happened, the war beneath those skies began to turn, steadily, relentlessly, toward a conclusion that even the fastest fighters could no longer outrun.